So the agenda. This was really how it started to coalesce. As I started to ask this question of people that I knew, it really came down to three different issues. One was, what are the sources of gaps? What's the context? What are the trend lines currently of the industry? And then ultimately, what does the future portend? So on the sources for gaps, and I apologize in advance, this might be the part where I start to lose some of you because I'm going to get, you saw that I taught. I might get a little bit wonky here in the first few minutes, but please stick with me. But the two things that coalesced almost immediately were obviously competency and communication. It makes sense. It's pretty obvious at the end of the day, but if you don't know what you don't know that there's a gap to begin with, right? And on communication in particular, if you're not clearly communicating with your design partners, your owners, you're not interpreting what their goals and vision are for the project, there's obvious gaps that are going to be created as well on that front. Two other things that started to kind of percolate out of those conversations was one, confidence, which was interesting to me because I hadn't really considered that initially, but it makes a lot of sense. If you are highly competent, but no one around you believes that what you're saying is true, then ultimately you're going to be creating gaps for some of your other potential design partners, clients, etc. Whether it's through provisions in what they're providing as far as information, or just contingencies they're building into their particular side of the ledger, for lack of a better term. It is a gap. It's a gap that ends up being created. And ultimately technology as well. There was a big generational shift between the people I talked to, but I've noticed it myself, and I'm kind of a tweener. I'm a Gen Xer. But a lot of the boomers that I talked to were basically pretty low on technology at the end of the day in many cases. Some were very, very high, some were very low. The younger generation were all in on technology, but the interesting thing about it was that some of the critiques I heard on the technology front is it related to things like communication styles and ultimately what the modeling programs are providing to potential design teams and also downstream to the contracting firms. It's creating gaps again, that things that generally speaking we kind of took for granted in many cases. So again, this is the part where I get wonky. But on the sources for gaps, I kind of went back to kind of psychology and some of the fundamental reasons for them. There was an individual named Martin Broadwell who was a famous psychologist, but he talked about the stages of learning, basically, and the four stages that he had identified really were, distilling it down into layman's terms. Essentially, you didn't know anything, and then by the end, you knew it because it was almost second nature to you. And in that case, or through that rubric, you can start to understand that, okay, well, from a competency standpoint, that all resonates, right? If you don't know what you don't know to basically provide information that would fill in a gap, potentially. There's also this other one that's kind of entertaining, Johari's window. If you've ever had a chance to do this exercise, I highly recommend it. It's actually kind of entertaining because the concept here is you take adjectives, apply it to either what is known or not known to yourself and others about you, and then you have someone else do the same exercise, one of your colleagues, just to see really kind of, are you interpreting the way that other people see your competence correctly or not? It's actually a useful exercise, and I've done it before. It was kind of entertaining. And then the famous, I think it was a 2002 press conference that Donald Rumsfeld put on. I kept on using this over and over again with students at the University of Washington to talk about contingencies, but sort of the concept of known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. Turns out it's actually not from him. It's from some NASA scientists that were involved with the space program. And obviously for them, unknown unknowns were a big deal because somebody would obviously die. So they were obviously very, very concerned about making sure that they had basically accounted for any potential contingencies that might ever end up actually matriculating into their world. In my mind, though, there's a hybrid, and I think the most successful hybrid for me as I'm thinking about it for construction or just the AEC industry as a whole is that, really there's really only two axes for me. It's competency plus consciousness. And hopefully by the time you get towards the end and you've reached the pinnacle of both, the known knowns are essentially accounted for, at least there's provisions in your plans for them. So the current context in this particular light is more just a discussion of what are the current trend lines, and across the board, the feedback I got was really on the expectation side. Design partners and clients are looking for more information, better information. They want it right now, and they want it as quickly as possible. That's just a reality. The days of being able to kind of go through the iterative process of SD, DD, CD feedback is still here to a large degree, but having reliable information that they can go to the bank on in an environment where their fees are challenges, the margins are a lot lower, et cetera, is very, very key. Degradation. I don't think I have to tell anybody here, but you've probably read all the stories. I mean, there's 80 million baby boomers, 40 million Gen Xers, and 80 million millennials. Just the demographics of it alone basically are leading to, in general, just a degradation and overall talent in the industry that is going to be a challenge for us. Communication, in many ways, is sort of stemming from that generational shift. A lot of the millennial folks tend to like email a lot more and texting than they like to talk face-to-face. I famously always give my millennial partners or coworkers a hard time that I can accomplish more in a 90-second phone call than you can accomplish in a 30-minute email. That's probably true, but they also have a record of it going forward as well, so there's give and takes on those fronts. And then complexity. I don't think anybody can deny that what we're providing now is a lot more complex than it has been in the past, whether it's building performance, sustainability, expectation levels of the marketplace, even the regulatory environment in many ways is getting a lot more challenging for all of us. So on the expectation front, clients are looking for certainty. They're looking for really actionable information at the end of the day, things that can be distilled into something that they can understand. Even if all of us as pre-construction professionals can understand this information and look at it, if the client can't understand it and make an informed decision based upon it, it's kind of useless. And they're also looking for context. As it relates to Seattle, it was kind of entertaining. About 10 years ago, there were, I think, maybe 3 high-rise rental apartment towers in all of Seattle. Since then, there have been, I think, close to 30 of them built. It's entertaining to hear clients ask about what's the person down the street doing. That's the crux of most of their answer or their questions. And they want that context. They want to have that information that's distilled in a way that they can, again, make informed decisions. On the competency front, again, the aging workforce, it's leading to worsening quality. The graph off to the right, or the graphic I should say, it stems from the AIA, but it's the makeup, I think as of 2015, of the current workforce of AIA professionals, not AIA accredited professionals. They didn't have a license. They were just people who are working as an architect somewhere in the country. Interesting thing is, note that bright red, that's the under 35 group within the AIA community right now. Only 19%. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, if you look at how much is 55 and over, it's over a third. So in the next 10 years, presuming that most of these people will end up retiring, you're going to lose almost a third of that workforce, a third of that knowledge set. It's going to be a challenge that I think is going to really be challenging for all of us, especially as we're working with design team partners. Same thing's happening on the field trade side as well. We at Cellen, we started to recognize about 2006 or 5, somewhere in that range. In 2009, we implemented a program on the field side to start training people to get up to speed more with just basic carpentry skill sets, and it's paid off pretty considerably. But again, it was something that we were starting to see pretty early, and now it's just exacerbated itself for the past 5 years. Also, in light of the fact that the Great Recession challenged a lot of fees, and most of our clients, even in Seattle, I mean, you guys have probably heard that, oh yeah, Seattle's really busy and everything. That's true, but our fees haven't gone up to match. It's not like the old days. It's not like the dot-com bubble and the housing bubble before that, where fees were all of a sudden everybody's, what's the quote, fat, dumb, and happy. That hasn't materialized in this last upswing. Most of the clients we work with have gotten used to relatively low margins. And there's been a lot of competition, and for the most part, they haven't been able to raise in a lot of cases. Same thing's happening, if probably not even worse, on the design side, as they are now being challenged to basically provide more services, more modeling services, more things, and a lot of times they're farming those out to third parties. It's basically been stemmed from the fact that they're having a really hard time competing in the marketplace. And ultimately as well, the young are rejecting labor in many cases. This has again been materialized on the field side, but it's ultimately led to some significant gaps from the standpoint of our ability to deliver. And we're seeing this a lot on the sub-trade side as well. Changing communication as well. So as younger generations have come on board, again, they're really in favor of email and text. And it's a different style of communication from the older set that wanted to talk face-to-face, wanted to pick up the phone and talk. It's leading to a style of communication that is ultimately leading to disconnects. So as we're looking to, again, reconcile reality with somebody's goals, if somebody's missing the boat from the standpoint of what's been communicated and it hasn't been clearly communicated between the different people or different parties, it's a major source of potential gaps between different individuals. At the same time, though, the industry has been moving primarily to more integration. So design build, a lot of the hybrids associated with design build, whether it's IPD or other contract types, have been sort of fostering that environment for people that would be essentially siloed in many cases to start to communicate better, and that's led to great synergies on many projects. I'd highly recommend that as you guys look to further that to essentially use, if not the contract dictates, at least the principles associated with it, because that's one of the obvious ways to kind of mitigate some of these gaps. One thing that I include here as well, which I thought was kind of entertaining, it's actually a quote from somebody that I won't credit them, but they said that the 10 ignoramuses can come up with an exponentially worse answer than one tyrannical figure that knows what they're doing. But it's basically a critique of groupthink. As we start to talk about, or we start to get into a situation where people are more specialized and there's more opportunities for people to live in their own silos, irrespective of what's happening from a contractual standpoint, there's a reality that there's, in many cases, not many people that understand the overall picture, especially as, again, those boomer generation people move on, and people that are stepping up don't necessarily have the perspective to understand that there's a better way, potentially. There's also increasing complexity. With the projects we're doing now, you cannot build what we're building today 3 or 4 years from now, especially in Seattle. The regulatory environment for us in particular is actually challenging. And this graphic off to the side is actually a demonstration of a study we did with PAE engineers and a company called McDonald Miller Facility Solutions, a mechanical subcontractor that does a lot of design build work, where we took prototypical buildings in Seattle and we essentially ran through the filter of the 2012 Seattle Energy Code and the 2015 Seattle Energy Code. And just as it related to office alone, the amount of cost, which was basically coming in the form of more complex HVAC distribution and terminal units, was extreme on the TI side. It was affecting the core and shell to a certain degree, but it was drastically affecting the tenants when they actually went to go build those projects or occupy them. It was a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, but again, it was a reality that we had to essentially, demonstrate to our clients that you couldn't do necessarily what you'd just done 2 or 3 years before. Also, the clients and user expectations are drastically changing. There's a lot of expectation on the tech side that you're going to be fulfilling sustainability goals, building performance goals. Even on the tenant side as it relates to residential, a lot of the potential tenants that I've spoken to, or I should say the clients that are looking to woo different individuals, the people that are renting apartments from them in many cases are looking for those types of elements as well. So again, it's changing, it's turning an apple into an orange, for lack of a better term. And on building technology, obviously building technology is just changing every day. I mean, no one can keep up with it. It's a significant challenge as it relates to gaps because many of the suppliers and design build subcontractors know far more about what the new technology is than the designers that are trying to implement them into the buildings. So it's one of those elements, especially as we're looking at early stages of design. If you don't have that kind of expertise in the room, you can basically create your own gaps just because of a lack of competency or a lack of awareness. Current technology, and I apologize to everybody except for Autodesk Min 360. This is not an advertisement, but just a demonstration of the fact that I think we've been challenged with it significantly, that there really isn't any clear winner. No software suite has really come up with a holistic answer that is consistent across the industry. There are many different answers for many different people. Again, large regional general contractor, that's kind of our bailiwick. Our answer might not be the answer for the civil contractor. It might not be the answer for the single family, obviously the single family home builder. There's just, again, not really a consistent answer at the end of the day, which has led to an issue where we have potentials for softwares essentially not interface smoothly enough to be able to provide as much data and actionable data as we'd like. Better data capture in general, though, has been an industry trend. I mean, I think for us in particular, we're getting a lot more data points than we have than we've ever had in the past. The challenge with those data points is that, generally speaking, and if you've dealt with this, you'll know what I mean, the data can lie to you. It can provide you with some information you thought was real, but really wasn't at the end of the day because it wasn't properly filtered. In many cases, it's oversimplified, it's out of date, it's not appreciative of scale and complexity. It might not be even appreciative of the actual circumstances of that project. And one of the biggest elements that is missed in a lot of the data capture is just the human element. Who was the superintendent? Who was the architect? Did you have an inspection regime in that particular city that was just a pain in the rump? Those types of factors are really hard to capture, but they do affect cost, schedule, and building performance. So what does the future portend? Consistently across the board, I got this feedback that ultimately it was going to be about data, communication, and ultimately training. So data on this particular element here is really, we're getting, again, lots and lots more data from software suites that are able to provide it. Clients are asking for it. They're building in the infrastructure to be able to capture, especially operations and maintenance data where they haven't in the past, and most of the time it's pretty reliable. The challenge there, though, again, is it something where we actually can use it intelligently moving forward? On the communication side, it's primarily, again, an issue of generational difference, but there are a lot of software suites now that are actually providing you with metadata and action or opportunities for you to track who has seen what during what points in time, so you can actually build yourself more or less a task list. There's an opportunity to provide accountability for people within the groups. And then training. It's obvious, but again, that generational shift is real. It's going to be felt throughout the entire industry. I think the firms that ultimately end up making provisions for it or plan for it, they're going to be the ones that are ultimately most successful. So on data capture and deployment in particular, automating data preparation for us has really been useful as it relates to providing some context for not only the client but ourselves. It also highlights those elements that are sort of outside of the norm. So if you see any data points that are exceeding a certain standard of deviation, they should be drawing your attention. But the key, though, is that whatever you're measuring against should have been filtered appropriately and applied appropriately to whatever you're trying to compare it to. On concentrating efforts, for us, again, large regional general contractor, we don't have all the resources in the world. If I were to come to my CEO tomorrow and say, hey, I've got this really great software, it's going to potentially game change it for us. We're going to have to make this $450,000 investment in terms of money and time and actually buying the software. I'd probably be laughed out of the room. Only if I could demonstrate that it was making a significant change. If it's just a marginal change, I can't make that investment. Now, some firms that are larger and have massive budgets, they might be able to accommodate that. Some people in this room, you might not be able to make an investment even $10,000 in some cases. The point is that we've had the most success with trying to focus on those elements that are the most effective for our way of essentially delivering a project. Whether it's protecting our risk or ultimately delivering a better project for our clients, those are the elements in software suites that we've really tried to concentrate on. And ultimately making more accessible presentations. So once we have this data, and it's hopefully filtered and coalesced in a way that it's actually an actual piece of information, basically providing it in a way that the clients, the design teams, others within the group that don't fully understand our business, it makes it clear for them. It makes it actionable for them to make a better project, to make it in a situation where they can understand what they, or how they relate to their potential opportunities and risks, what things they can and can't do about that particular issue, and ultimately, provide an opportunity for them to help them help themselves. So along those lines, this is kind of a pretty dumbed down version of that, but we had a client that was asking recently, a couple of years ago actually, that tends to be one of those types of clients that builds in cycles, and they hit the market at the bottom of the market, and then they build a bunch of projects, sell them off, and then come back a few years later when the cycle is reintroduced again, and then they do the same thing over and over again. Lather, rinse, repeat, basically, and it's been a very successful model for them. The challenge has been is that they've come back into the marketplace after basically liquidating all their existing properties, and they're finding that's a vastly different marketplace than it was for them previously. And for them, we had a couple different versions of this, but we were trying to demonstrate to them that a lot of things had changed. The building market obviously had changed, is what the expectations levels of the marketplace were. The construction cost escalation had obviously gone up. There wasn't a recession in the meantime that ultimately kind of flattened out some prices. And ultimately, the regulatory environment had changed so that you couldn't build what you had built even 2-3 years before. So for us, we were trying to distill it for them to say, well, based upon different systems, you have 2 different potential projects, one of which is challenged by geometry and one isn't. And it was demonstrated just quickly by essentially demonstrating the math problem to them. One was demonstrating an orange dot here, and the other one was a purple dot, the green being the median between a data set of about 22 different projects that we gave to them to say, this is where you line up in relationship to your competition. And the interesting thing about it was that they were very upset about the fact that their purple building, in this case, was just not reaching what they thought was the market. It didn't look as good. It didn't have as high a performing system. But ultimately, the reason was because it was a relatively small floor plate in relationship to the other project that they were potentially going to build. So it was literally just a math problem. Just had more skin per gross. In this case, the cost actually was, you can even see it demonstrated here, it was a lower price point, but ultimately a higher ratio of skin to gross, so it was being affected on for what their metric was, which is rentable over gross, drastically by just the fact that it had a smaller floor plate. Every one of the systems was affected by it ultimately. On parametric analysis, I think the one thing that is most interesting about the opportunities associated with this is that, and if you've dealt with this in the past, you've tried to build feature sets that try to capture as many of the variables that are out there, is that there really are limitations to what you can ask that level of parametric analysis to ultimately give you back in the form of reliable information. The challenge is that most of the time it's either down to either a very, very finite level of comparison, so I'm talking about productivities of square foot of formwork in place, Or generally speaking, it's up at the higher end. It's, dollar per gross square foot of this, or dollar per vertical square foot of skin, or dollar per ton of HVAC system. Very, very gross analysis at the end of the day. But you have to be mindful of the filters, appropriately filtering them. For us, it's code, site, zoning, date, program, team, design. It's kind of entertaining. I can actually kind of tell with us which superintendent worked on which project based upon how it was staffed and what their productivities are. It's an uncomfortable conversation with some of them, but ultimately, you can. The data sets are actually providing that level of analysis now. It's kind of entertaining. We haven't necessarily had that in the past, but it's becoming more real. And also focusing on the outliers. So in many cases, there are projects that you'll have that's going to essentially provide you with some information you think you're doing relatively well, but ultimately, there's maybe a couple different elements associated with it that are challenging the project overall. The data can help to distill that information for you. So one of the questions we had from one of our tech-focused clients was related to how much are we spending per gross square foot of a build-out, basically, compared to our competition. So for us, we just took several different projects. We actually did this in collaboration with another general contractor that we're working with on this project, and basically took a bunch of the potential build-out costs, normalized it for today's dollars, but again, the denominator here was dollars per gross square foot. And what it basically said was that we had a previous budget of X, which was kind of halfway in between, middle of the fairway. They were ultimately looking at potentially providing potential bells and whistles, amenities, things of that nature that basically would be putting them in a different category towards the top. But our point to them was that they were looking at it through the wrong denominator. It wasn't just dollars per gross square foot, it was dollars per person. So when you looked at it through that rubric, and I think many of you probably have already heard about this or dealt with this personally, many clients are looking at it from the standpoint, or many, especially office clients, are looking to potentially take the number of people and increase them per square foot of building. The challenge on that front was that per person, their costs were actually off the charts. But looking at that same data set through a different window, basically, is providing some pretty powerful information for them. Now, they ultimately decided to continue to go down that road of providing essentially more square feet per person. They think it's a differentiator for them. But at least they go into it eyes wide open that it's not necessarily our fault or the design team's fault. It's a conscious decision that they're making. Also, highly recommend as you start to get more data sets, looking at project variables and providing, and I know this is really difficult for any of us that come primarily from an estimating or a pre-construction background, providing some context in the form of ranges of potential exposure. So as we're looking at not necessarily scope, but just, well, not scope, but it's pretty much just, topics, issues that could be arising during the process of the project development, looking at what are the potential exposures of different issues on a project and providing that context for a client. Is it a big issue or is it a small issue? And even if you have to provide a large range, giving them a sense for this is why we're concerned is very, very helpful in trying to demonstrate risk to a client. And also, as you start to mitigate that risk, you can start to take credit for it. You can start demonstrating to them what your value has been through that process. And also evaluating risk as well, just to bracket costs, especially as it relates to contingencies. I like to say that contingencies are, let's see if this will go here. Maybe not. There we go. I like to say that contingencies are basically looking for a source of a gap, essentially. We carry them, owners carry them, design teams like to carry them. The reality, though, is unfortunately, in many cases, they are not optimizing the project. So we know that there's a gap, but we're going to plug it here with some money. Can we define it very well? Sometimes. Is it optimizing the project at the end of the day? Probably not. It's protecting each one of the individuals involved in the process to a large degree, but how real is it at the end of the day? And is anybody really spending much time understanding what those contingencies represent? That was funny. I was asking people what they thought about these particular contingencies, and this was sort of the grotesque version of each one of them. But obviously, I like the one that says design contingencies, the architect's piggy bank. But I've dealt with that in the past, where a lot of architects they kind of acted like that design development contingency is theirs. Like, oh, I get to put more scope in the projects. Like, no. That's not what that's for. Ultimately, though, the projects that I've had the most success with, and I think this was pretty universal, especially with people that had done design build projects, was having a true project contingency, one that everyone understood, and trying to be as transparent as possible about it. I know that's not a reality or possible on some projects, just based upon the realities of the contract type or whether it's a public or private issue. But as much as possible, I think it really helps the process to understand really what those contingencies represent. Because if we're trying to plug gaps, let's try to get intelligent about how we're doing so, especially as we're looking at things like design degradation. We personally, Selin, have hired a design professional in-house to start evaluating designs. So as we're getting lower quality information, we're starting to basically demonstrate to clients that we need to provide more contingency or provisions in the budget because we're not getting definition from the design team yet. And at least starts to prioritize that conversation so we're, again, trying to fill in the gaps between what we are expecting versus the reality that's ultimately going to be being built. Highly recommend as well that contractors take the lead on these particular elements because we control most of the cost at the end of the day. Even if you're looking from a project cost standpoint, we ultimately control 70 to 80% of the overall project cost. We, generally speaking, understand it the best. The difference between us and the other people involved in the project is that I think in the past we haven't challenged ourselves to provide that information in a way that is contextualized the same way that design teams do. Think of those design reviews that you've been through with clients and how they're providing graphical information. They're leading them down the path of a decision, and they're demonstrating what they're doing in pretty simple terms. At the end of the day, they're providing them an answer. I think we in the contracting community can learn quite a bit from that particular that phenomenon. And also other escalation factors. The one thing I think that a lot of people are confused about, especially on the client and design side, is that when you read E&R and you see that there's a certain percentage of differential in escalation, they walk away thinking that that is what escalation really is. It isn't, right? It's just a basket of goods. They're looking at a yard of concrete, so many MBF of lumber, and what is it, like an hour of labor hours or something? Anyway, it's not the entire market. It's not appreciating opportunity costs. It's not appreciating the fact that in many cases, you might have a finite number of subcontractors, and they may all be busy. So they're now going to have to bid your job with their D team, and ultimately, they're going to charge you for it. The difference between price and cost is real. And trying to demonstrate to clients, or that to clients, I think is ultimately key. But I think about through these 5 filters, not only what the input costs are, which are pretty easy to measure, and they're backed up by a lot of industry information, but also looking at the construction market, what's the opportunity cost of a lot of the contracting partners, what is the difference between price and cost? Looking at the building market, what's the market actually, and this is more from the clients, what's the market demanding now? What's that apple now turning into? Is it turning into an orange? I look at office projects we delivered 20 years ago, and we could never deliver that building today. It wouldn't be anywhere near the market. But appreciating that difference is hard for a lot of clients. Looking at what the government and the regulatory environment is forcing in many ways, or at least asking for, especially for us in Seattle with the energy code and a lot of the other elements related to stormwater management, et cetera, it's challenging. Every code cycle, there's a new requirement that's coming up that's changing what we're building. And ultimately, obviously, again, macroeconomic issues. I mean, for us in Seattle, it was pretty stark as it related to Chinese investment and then divestment within our local real estate market. It went all the way from buying land for way more than it was worth to ultimately a lot of developers now and contracting teams delivering buildings right now that don't actually pencil. How do you compete with that? But it also affects the market, right? The expectation level amongst most of the players now is that that's the new gold standard, right? That's what we have to build. That's what the person down the street's doing. Yeah, there we go. So all that on the data side. Obviously, a lot to chew on there. I think ultimately as well on the communication side, we had to reconcile this difference in generations. And there are some improvements on software that are helping to do so. But ultimately, and especially on the accountability front, but also ultimately I think it's, if there's any way for us to demonstrate competency to design teams and clients through visualizations, through elements that basically help distill complex information in a way that's digestible, is ultimately going to be the difference between being successful and not really at the end of the day. It's cutting through the fog. Also bolstering competency. And I put this in here because it should make a lot of sense, or it should be obvious that training is important, but again, appreciating the fact that there's this big generational shift is ultimately going to lead to a lot of gaps. I'm already noticing it with things that I used to just sort of take take for granted, frankly. That, that's how you just do that. That's how it's done. It makes all the sense in the world to me, but it doesn't make sense to the 30-year-old that doesn't know what they don't know. And making that investment, and I've seen some firms do a really great job of that, other firms, not so much in some cases. It may be because they think they have it licked, but in some cases, I think it's just that they're missing the boat. And also investing in data. It's, the way that, you can basically, in partnering, any way you can make yourself better and put yourself in the position of a trusted advisor to a client, I think is ultimately going to be key. Long term, I think ultimately it's going to be not just an estimate and a schedule anymore, it's going to be a demonstration of project opportunities. Showing a client what they can or can't do based upon the amount of information you can pull together. And the faster you can do that, the earlier on in the process you can do that, assuming you're involved, the better. There's so many issues we run into, especially later on design, that really were set from day one. That if we could have demonstrated that to them and they could have made appropriate provisions either through redesigning the building or reconfiguring it, would have probably potentially solved us a lot of heartache. Contracting methods, I think that's just here to say. From the design build side, I hear that consistently across I talk to a lot of clients and owners. They're starting to really see the light, especially on the public side, obviously. I mean, design build for them is sort of the panacea. Any way you can get away from the traditional design bid build world, they're all for. Any way you can infuse intelligence earlier on with people that really know what they're looking at, and then if there's somebody involved that actually can look across that entire landscape and not necessarily pick winners, but find those synergistic opportunities between different disciplines, those people are ultimately, I think, going to win. And I think ultimately as well, this is the new yardstick. Any way we can find ways to fill in the gaps, using data, improving communication, and ultimately making sure that the next generation is trained well, is going to be the way that essentially you're the differentiating yourself from your competition. So with that, I want to thank Hanson Wade for the opportunity to speak here today, and especially Nicole and Maddie for keeping me on track in many cases. And thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.